I thought it might be cool to start with a poem from ModPo Plus. It is a poem by Yolanda Wisher. It is not a 1930s poem. Yolanda has a deep, strong connection to the first generation of Harlem Renaissance poets, but doesn't think of herself as a Harlem Renaissance poet or necessarily a direct descendant. But she writes a poem called From Imhotep's Kundalini. And its first line, and I'm giving the TAs a chance to get to it, so it's linked from ModPo Plus. It's also on the Poetry Foundation site if you simply want to do a search that way. And it is a sonnet. It is a sonnet. So it really has relevance to the kind of conversations that we have in week 5 about the use of poetic form, traditional poetic form. We also have a fabulous recording of Yolanda in this building, in our studio, reciting this poem. So here is Yolanda Wisher reciting in Imhotep's Kundalini.
From Imhotep's Kundalini. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Du Bois, of bodies rocked and minds embalmed in bark, our blanched arrival seethen with scandal's mark. Nowadays I peep you in the bean pie seller's poise. With that silhouette fit for bust or cameo, I can't always divine your debonair birth, or your buku brain laboring like an earth, in hallelujah's ether, somehow ducking death's blow. Sure sprung from Imhotep's Kundalini, stitching white reconstruction's funeral shroud, scripting Philly dirges for the crying out loud, cussing Garvey's name over martinis. Sometimes I wonder if you double agent on the page, or mastermind of our ordered rage.
Thank you for attending to that. Amazing, amazing reading. So we're not going to do a close reading of the poem. In fact, there is one available on the ModPo Plus site. But what I thought I would do is throw out to some of you folks a question about some aspects of it. For instance, the first line, of course, quotes a poem that we have already talked about in ModPo. What is Yolanda trying to do there? The second question I would have is, why is it important that this is a sonnet? It's actually a Shakespearean sonnet with the couplet at the end. And how does that square or not square with Yolanda Wisher's unbelievable adeptness at the demotic speech, particularly Philadelphia local speech? And how does that square with the high diction that you would expect from a sonnet? So I want to ask Allie, Kinar, Gabby, and Amber Rose in turn to just make any comment you want on this poem. Remember, our goal is to encourage ModPo people who don't know this poem to read it and contemplate it. So Allie first. Hi, Allie.
Hi. I'm so glad we got to hear that out loud because it's so satisfying orally. And I mean, I always kind of start backwards with this poem in the last 2 lines. Sometimes I wonder if you double agent on the page or mastermind of our ordered rage. The whole kind of like crux or question that she's posing with the form and content tension.
That's the double agency, isn't it?
Mm.
Wow. And it's also a reference to Du Bois and the divided consciousness, double consciousness. Great start. Yes. Okay, cool. Kinar, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, perhaps kind of continuing with the idea of double agency and double consciousness in relation to form. I mean, I think the use of the sonnet in this sonnet form for this poem is sort of a double agency of sorts. That's, resisting essentializing the sonnet form, and there's no sort of easily simplified kind of pressure on the form, I wouldn't say, but there is nonetheless sort of a retooling and usage of it that I think is really incredible.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, so this is so week 5, and I hope we'll maybe broaden out to talk generally about this whole question of poets choosing to use established forms in order to do radical content. That's just not a strategy that we typically saw prior to this in the early modernists. They really wanted the form to be broken so they could talk about the broken things of their world. And now we're facing this decision by not just by the Harlem Renaissance poets, but also by the so-called communist poets to try to do other things with established forms. Very cool. Gabby and then Amber Rose.
Yeah, I think I just want to take up making a comment about the first stanza. So obviously what thoughts I have of you tonight is a reference to Ginsberg's Supermarket in California. What thoughts I have of you tonight, Walt Whitman. And in that poem, the sort of like trans-historical gesture is primarily erotic. The fantasy is that Walt Whitman, among others, is like moving through the suburban supermarket and like flirting with the cashiers and the boys that are working the store. And what I like about this first stanza is the last line, actually. Nowadays I peep you in the bean pie seller's poise, which feels like a kind of version of the same lines from the Ginsberg, insofar as like, oh, I see you, you know, flirting with the checkout boy, or I see you among the bananas or whatever. In this case, it's not that Du Bois is talking to the bean pie seller, but he's visible in the poise of the bean pie seller. So it's almost like the bean pie seller projects Du Bois in some way. And I think like so the trans-historical gesture is slightly different. Seems slightly less erotic, somewhat more historical, and somewhat more about kind of legacy work.
So great. Such a great reading of the fourth line of the first stanza, Gabby. So great. Yeah, and that is a pretty subtle difference. Peep you in the bean pie sellers. I mean, one assumes there's a certain proletarianism in the bean pie seller, or maybe the bean pie seller is you know, not in business, but is just trying to make do, right? So there's a class thing here, whereas the Ginsberg is a little less interested than perhaps he should be in the class of people, the difference between Ginsberg, who has the leisure to shop at night because he's lonely and wants company, and the grocery boys who have to do this awful work of setting up the avocados and so forth. I think this is Du Bois is a more overtly political mentor and than Whitman, and this poem goes further politically than Ginsberg. Very cool. Amber Rose, your thought on this, and then we'll move on. 610-616-3208 is the phone. Amber Rose, hello.
Hi. Yeah, I'll contribute a thought. I want to say something about the use of language and this like really distinct Philly slang. I love this poem so much because Yolanda Wisher is modeling what she is saying or observing Du Bois to be modeling, which is taking these formal structures and infusing them with an awareness and with the life energy of Black sociality. So Du Bois was someone who was doing ethnographic surveys of Black folks in a time when people were not at all interested in taking seriously attending to Black life. And Du Bois was very much about presenting Black life honestly and respecting its nuances and refusing to let it be kind of a flatline way of engaging with a population of people. So Yolanda Wisher is taking this really formal structure and infusing it with this other language and still kind of playing her own double agency. We see in a word like buku, like the phrase buku brain laboring like an earth. Buku is kind of playing on Black slang that's just like, yeah, hella big, or just like a lot of something, but also this really formal kind of French term that's spelled in a different way that means the same thing. But if you're just hearing it, you wouldn't recognize that on the page. She's playing with a different kind of, she's playing with multiple cultures. And I also just wanted to say that I'm also kind of excited about the line where she mentions cussing Garvey's name over martinis. That's a reference to Marcus Garvey, who had very different kind of political ideology than Du Bois. But again, she's not allowing it to be a kind of flat line where all of these Black social theorists that were alive and engaging are automatically agreeing. In fact, we have Du Bois cussing out Marcus Garvey over martinis and letting us know that those risks and those complexities still exist.
So well said. Thank you, Amber Rose. The refusal by Yolanda Wisher to subscribe to any kind of pure ideology does not mean she's less political. This is not an end of ideology statement. This is life lived politically is nuanced and difficult and incredibly pleasurable. Script in Philly dirges for the crying out loud. I mean, there's both horror and sadness, but also joy in crying out loud,